How's it going, fellas? My name's Andy, and today we're gonna take a look at Ben Wallace. How good was he actually? And recently, he just got snubbed again from the 2018 Hall of Fame class, so will he get into the Hall of Fame eventually? Now, Wallace's career is a bit hard to evaluate if you haven't seen him play. His career stats and even his highlight videos don't do him justice, because the ridiculous impact he had on the floor is not reflected in either of them. Here are his career stats. 6 points a game, 9 rebounds, 41% free throw percentage, and a rather mediocre field goal percentage for a center. He did record some good block and steal numbers, but just from looking at those stats, you'd assume that he was just a role player or something. And I guess you could make that case, but I don't agree with it. He was not a role player. In my opinion, he was a superstar on the defensive end, and he's one of the few players in history who had just as much of an impact on defense, if not a greater impact than other offensive superstars. Wallace had his best seasons on the Detroit Pistons. From 2002 to 2006, he made 5 all-defensive first-team selections, got selected for 4 All-Star games, and led the league in rebounding twice and in blocks once. Led the league in defensive win shares for 4 straight seasons, and also won 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Keep in mind, he was only 6 foot 9 inches tall. That's what he's listed at, but even 6 foot 9 is a bit generous. Apparently he was closer to 6'7" without shoes on. Leading the league in rebounding and blocks at that height is ridiculous. He also tied Dikembe Mutombo for the most Defensive Player of the Year awards won by a single player. Oh, and guess what? This guy went undrafted. He was part of the 1996 draft class, one of the greatest drafts in NBA history. And a lot of people probably didn't even know he was in the same draft class as these guys. And up until now, he's still the first and only undrafted player to ever be selected as a starter for the All-Star game. Additionally, like what I mentioned earlier, Wallace's legacy and on-court production transcended beyond all of these stats and accolades. He actually made defense fun to watch. In pretty much every single game, Wallace was at a height disadvantage against whoever he was guarding, but he would constantly suffocate them and hold big men far below their season averages. Part of the reason he was able to stand his ground was because, well, he was really freaking strong. Nobody except maybe Shaq was able to move him in the post since he was so strong, and sometimes even Shaq had trouble against him. Besides that though, Wallace was also a great pick-and-roll defender for his time. Even though pick-and-rolls were not as common as they are today, he was very quick on his feet earlier in his career, which allowed him to effectively defend perimeter players for short periods of time. From 2003 to 2006, the Pistons always finished top 5 in defensive efficiency, with Wallace anchoring the defense. Another thing I want to bring up is that throughout NBA history, players who were primarily good at just defense did not get paid as much as players who were just strictly offensive players. It makes sense though, for the average audience, offense is just way more exciting to watch than defense. So you gotta give them bigger contracts because they're bringing in more people to watch the games. For example, I'm sure 99% of the world would rather watch James Harden than Andre Robertson. Great defense was unappealing to watch back then. However, Wallace was the player who changed that. In fact, he was statistically one of the worst offensive players in the league for years. But he still got paid like a superstar when the Bulls offered him a hefty 4-year, $60 million contract. And nowadays, you have all of these defensive-minded centers being paid a lot of money even if they aren't stars, like Steven Adams or even Jan Mahimi, who's getting paid $16 million a year for some reason. I'm sorry, Wizards fans. And let's not forget about Joakim Noah's 4-year, $72 million deal either. But yeah, without Wallace setting the standard, many defensive-minded centers who are average or mediocre offensively would have never gotten this type of respect or money. He made the NBA realize that, wow, if there's a big man who has any semblance of good defense, then they're very valuable and worth a lot. Now, obviously, this way of thinking has backfired sometimes, and we see a lot of big men today who are heavily overpaid and clogging up a team's cap space. But hey, it's better for the players at least. Guys like Mahimi, Mozgov, and Biyombo should all be thanking Wallace, and the salary cap spike. Anyway, Wallace was also an inspiration for a lot of undersized big men as well, as he showed everyone that players can still be amazing even if they're giving up a couple of inches. Draymond Green has stated that Big Ben was his inspiration growing up. Green grew up in Michigan and was lucky enough to watch Wallace in his prime with the Pistons, but there was something that always boggled his mind. He never understood how Wallace was so undersized yet dominated anyone who challenged him. How in the world was Wallace doing this? It didn't make any sense to him. But Green was able to meet him when he was a kid and found out quickly why he was so good. It was because Wallace had a relentless work ethic and he refused to be outworked by anyone in a game or at practice. When you're already undersized, you can't let others outwork you or else you'll never make it to the NBA. Green took his words of advice and modeled his own game after his. Even to this day, the two of them are still friends, and in 2017 when Draymond Green won Defensive Player of the Year, Wallace actually presented him with the trophy. Anyway, Wallace ended up signing with the Bulls for the 2006-07 season and instantly turned them into the best defensive team in the league. Previously, in 2005-06, the Bulls were 7th in the league in defensive rating, so jumping from 7th to 1st is pretty crazy. Wallace helped the young Bulls team to 49 wins, but unfortunately they lost in the second round of the playoffs to his former team, which is kinda funny. But even without Wallace, the Pistons were still considered a great team this year. The problem was, they had a huge hole at center and their rebounding dropped off a lot. Since they ended up moving Rasheed Wallace to center and their big man rotation consisted of an aging Chris Webber and Antonio McDyess. Their lack of interior defense was very clear in the 2007 Eastern Conference Finals. Most of you probably remember the series, and if you don't, I definitely recommend watching the highlights. And although it was true that he was bad offensively and the Pistons did continue to make the conference finals, the team was never the same after he was gone. They were still winning over 50 games for a few years and remained a great regular season team. But at the time, the general consensus was that the Pistons were no longer legit contenders without Wallace. So, how good was Ben Wallace actually? He was, in my opinion, the greatest defender in the last 20 years. But offensively, he was pretty bad. I still think he should be in the Hall of Fame though, since, 4-time Defensive Player of the Year is insane. In his prime, he was winning the award over guys like Duncan and Garnett, and we know how amazing those two were on defense. It might take a couple years for Wallace to get in, but he will eventually, I'm sure of it. And that's it for this video. Let me know your thoughts on Ben Wallace. When do you think he'll get into the Hall of Fame? He definitely should eventually. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.